Welcome to my July wrap-up of all the books that I read in July. I read 18 books this month, which is a little bit absurd, especially because some of them were actually pretty long. I think I read just over 6,000 pages, which is truly a new record for me, I think. But what can I say? It was quarantine, pandemic time, and also the reading rush happened. I never posted my last day of the reading rush because that's when stuff went down with the reading rush. This was my first year participating in the reading rush, but I don't think that I will be participating again because I feel like the hosts, which I really honestly didn't know a ton about the hosts either, I don't think that they handled themselves very well. So, I never posted my last day of the reading rush, and I don't really want to align myself too much with the reading rush anymore. But I did do the challenges of the reading rush, and so I did read 7 books in 7 days, and then I read the rest of the month. So, I read a combination of physical books, audiobooks, and books on my Kindle. So I don't have all of the books that I read in physical copies, but I do have a lot of them. So without further ado, let's just talk about the books I read this month. The first book I read this month was Girl with a Pearl Earring by Tracy Chevalier. And this book is really short. I read it literally the first day of the month. I read it in one day. It's super quick to read, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was great. It's historical fiction taking place in Holland in the time when Vermeer, the famous Dutch painter, was... The book is about Vermeer and his household. And The Girl with a Pearl Earring is a painting by Vermeer that's really famous, and so this book just sort of gives a historical fiction context to that book. And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was great. The next book I read this month was The Year of the Flood by Margaret Atwood, which is the sequel to Margaret Atwood's book Oryx and Crake, which is sort of a dystopian novel, I guess. It has elements of plague. This is why I read Oryx and Crake, is I'm working on a project related to pandemic fiction. And so I read Oryx and Crake, and I really liked Oryx and Crake. I read it for research, but honestly, I really enjoyed it as well. So I decided to read the sequel, and I do think that the sequel fell a little short from what I was expecting based on the quality of the first book. But I mean, sequels do this pretty frequently. It was taking place in the same time frame of events as the first book, but it's just from different characters' perspectives. And then everybody meets up at the end, like the people from the first book and then the people from this sequel meet up. And there is a third book, and I'm torn about if I want to read it or not, because I really did think that The Year of the Flood felt kind of short, and I feel like proceeding on with the story even further would just be a detriment. You know? This one, I would say, was a 3 out of 5. Okay, the next book I read this month, I actually do have the physical copy for, and it is In a Sunburned Country by Bill Bryson. And this book is nonfiction. Bill Bryson writes nonfiction about places he's traveled and kind of does... It's very humorous, it's not... Usually his books are not purely informational, they're more of like a journey and a story. His most famous book, A Walk in the Woods, is about the Appalachian Trail, and that was the first book I read by him, and I absolutely loved it. So I've read a lot more of his work since then, and mostly I've found that I really enjoy what he writes. This one was a little bit of an exception. This one's about Australia, and I found that it was a little bit too on the informational side and less about his opinions and journey, and I really want to hear what he's thinking about everything rather than just these are facts about Australia, which is sort of what I felt like I was getting. I will say that I'm going to keep this book, and if I ever am planning to go to Australia, I think that there will be a lot of really good information in this book for practical application. But I do think that if you're just looking to read, travel writing for the Wanderlust that usually Bill Bryson provides, where you just want to feel like you're exploring as well. This one fell a little short for me. I did still give it a 3 out of 5, though. Next up is my least favorite book that I read this month, which is Disappearing Earth by Julia Phillips. And this book, I actually had pretty high expectations for. Somebody recommended it to me. I'm not sure who, actually. And it has to do with these 2 girls are kidnapped. Then there's a lot of little short stories afterwards that all relate to this kidnapping, but don't really do anything about it. I don't know. I felt like it was really disjointed and hard to have any kind of plot going throughout. Like, every time I would be reading a section and get invested in those characters, all of a sudden we were done with their story and it would move on to the next. And I don't really like that. I want to be able to get invested and follow characters throughout the whole book. I felt like it was a short story collection that just had a common theme, kind of, and not anything else. I thought the writing style was nice. I liked the writing style, but the plot and the story just didn't do it for me. Next up, I read The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wohlleben. His name is German, so I may be mispronouncing it. But this is a book it's nonfiction, and it's truly about just trees and all that they get up to. And I thought it was really interesting. I mean, I like trees. I really do like reading nonfiction, so I enjoyed this nonfiction book. I listened to it on audiobook, which I feel like is maybe not what I should do with nonfiction, because I sometimes want to be able to go back and reference it, and when I listen to audiobooks, I get them from the library, so I don't have that book anymore. But I did really enjoy it, and I found it really informative. There were a few little parts that were a little bit dry and kind of hard to get through, but since I was listening to it on audiobook, I could listen to it while I was doing other things, and then that sort of solved that problem. But I felt like if I had been actually reading it, there would have been a few spots where I would have been like, I don't care. I did really like this book. I thought it was great, especially if you like trees, you know? The next book also has trees in the name, but it's The People in the Trees by the author of A Little Life, Hanya. What is her name? Hanya Yanagihara. Hopefully I am pronouncing that correctly. But anyways, I read A Little Life about a year ago, and it's truly one of the best books I've ever read. I think it's amazing. So I was really excited to read this debut work, and I would say that it wasn't as good as A Little Life, but I did think that it was very good. And I think she really has a way of writing bad characters and bad people in a way that doesn't feel like judgment on them, but also not romanticizing or condoning them, if that makes any sense. I just think that the way this book was written, because the subject matter and the main character is truly a horrible person. But I wasn't rooting for him, but I also didn't hate him so much that I didn't care about the book, if that makes sense. So I really liked this one. I gave it a 4 out of 5. I didn't think it was top tier work like A Little Life, but I did really like it. Okay, next up, I read Shadow of Night by Deborah Harkness. This is the second book in the All Souls trilogy, which the first one is A Discovery of Witches, which you may have heard of. I didn't love the first book. I think I gave it a 3 out of 5. Maybe even a 2 out of 5. I can't even remember. But it's not amazing. It's kind of a little bit trying to be adult Twilight, maybe? I mean, it's about vampires, and there's, like, forbidden love, and blah, 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 blah. But I liked the premise of it enough, because there are other elements that are more kind of historical fiction elements, which I like. And so I did want to read the second one. Also, I bought the second one before reading the first one. So I already had this before I even knew how I felt about the first one. And so I was like, you know what, we're gonna do it. We're gonna read this trilogy. So I read the second one, and it was better than the first one, I will say. It still wasn't amazing. I think I still gave this a 3 out of 5. But I did like it better. It really, I mean, it's a big book, and it drug on. Oh my goodness. Not that much happens in this book. But here we are at frickin' 600 pages or something. But I thought it was fine. It did better than the first one. I still like the premise enough that I'm gonna read the last book. But I think that this trilogy in general is not anything that special. It is, like I said, really reminiscent of, like, Twilight. And, people love Twilight, and there's a reason people love Twilight, and there's a reason people like this trilogy as well. This was recommended to me by my mom and my grandma, who really think that this trilogy is amazing. And, who might have yucked their yum, But, I'm gonna read the third one, and then we're gonna say goodbye to this trilogy, and that's how we feel about this. Next up, I read High Fidelity by Nick Hornby, and this was a super quick read for me. I read it on audiobook, so I think I listened to it in about a day, and I don't really know what I was expecting High Fidelity to be. I think it had a lot of 90s nostalgia in it, which, if that's what you're going for in a book, there you go. It was sort of, it kind of reminded me of Ready Player One in terms of, like, nostalgia levels and, like, name dropping of bands. But it was also a big, like, sort of character study into this guy's romantic relationships and how he can never really figure it out. And, I think it didn't really age well. I think that it's a little outdated. But it does have a lot of 90s nostalgia in terms of music, and I did think it was well written, I guess. It was just fine. I gave it a 3.5, I think, out of 5. Maybe a 3. I don't know. But it was fine. And then the next book I read while we were camping, and I brought my Kindle with me and read out in the sunshine in the camping environment. And it was a great time. I read Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn. And I had read Gone Girl a long time ago. And this was the first Gillian Flynn that I had picked up since then. I thought it was good. I liked Gone Girl when I read it. Although I think, like, if I were to read Gone Girl now, I wouldn't think it was, like, that amazing. But I thought Sharp Objects was good. It was I guessed who it was. I guessed the crime committer from the beginning. But there were a few twists that I didn't really predict, and I liked the style of writing. So I liked this one. I gave it a 4 out of 5. 4 out of 5. And yeah, I thought it was good. The next book I read was If It Bleeds by Stephen King, which is a collection of 4 novellas that he wrote. It just came out very recently. And the title story, If It Bleeds, sort of has a similar premise, or like some overlapping characters, to the Mr. Mercedes series and also the book The Outsider, which I have not read any of those. And I still, like, you can still read the story if you haven't, but I sort of feel like I should have, especially because I've read almost all of Stephen King's work, and so that's sort of like the big hole in what I haven't read yet. And then so I feel like I should have read that before this, but I didn't, and it was fine. The other 3 stories are also just fine. I thought that this was a pretty, like, medium level collection of novellas. It was fine. It wasn't anything. I mean, his other collection, Different Seasons, that has, like, The Body and Shawshank Redemption, that collection is top tier, really good. This was not that. It was still fine. I mean, it was still fine. That's all I got. Now we're getting into the Reading Rush books that I read. So if you want to hear more thoughts, I guess, go watch those other reading vlogs. I don't know. But here we are. So the first book that I read for the Reading Rush was A Newfoundlander in Canada by Alan Doyle. Really liked this. Gave it a 4 out of 5. It is a very quick read, very lighthearted. It's about family. It's about being a touring musician. It's kind of a travel memoir about Canada. I feel like I can feel his nostalgia in this book, and I can feel his love for his roots and his family in this book, which I love. And also, if you know his music, then I feel like that enhances the experience. I listened to his music while I was reading the book. Great experience. Loved it. So, yeah, if you know who Great Big Sea is at all, or you're curious about Canadian maritime folk music, give this baby a try. Okay, and then the next one I read for the reading rush was The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This book was hard to read in one day, which I did read it I read it mostly in one day, and then I finished the last 5% of it the next morning. And it's a little hard to read in one day, but I did really like it. It has historical fiction, it has magic, it has so much human emotion. It's such an emotional story, really well written, very nice language. And yeah, I really liked it. I ended up reading it at the same time as my mom read it, so we had a little talk about it, and she really liked it as well. Now we get to talk about The Lord of the Rings. I read The Fellowship of the Ring this month, which is just the first third of this book, and I've only read the first one. I've only read Fellowship of the Ring, but I really liked it. You know, this was the first 5 out of 5 for the month. It's just, you can just tell how much influence The Lord of the Rings has had on every fantasy book that's come after it, really. And it's so detailed and crafted in such a way that creates such a whole other world. Middle Earth is truly another world, and it's so well developed, it feels like it could be real. And that's what you want in fantasy. Again, I tried to read The Fellowship of the Ring in one day, and I did actually read it in one day, and it's hard to do that with so many names and so many places and trying to keep track of everything and read it fast. I don't really recommend doing that, so the other two I will not be forcing myself to read in one day, but I did like this a lot. 5 out of 5. I mean, we all knew that Lord of the Rings is good, I think, but, you know, if you need me to say it too, Lord of the Rings is good. And now, the next book I read, it was Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer. 4 out of 5. Really liked it. It's sad, but also such a captivating story, and so interesting. I love books about Alaska. I read books about Alaska all the time, and so this was a great addition, and I guess this is sort of one of the original books about Alaska. Also in the reading rush, I read Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. I've never read it before. I did in July, and I'm glad I did it. I think my one complaint is that it had too much hype. I had such high expectations for this little tiny book that I couldn't just possibly meet all of them in 194 pages. And that was it's not really the book's fault. It's more of the book's hype that got in the way. But I thought it was still great. I just wish that it had been more, you know? Next on my list of books I read this month was The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. And oh my goodness, this was a sad book. It's so beautifully written, devastating. And I sort of knew that going into it, but it still hit me, like, hard. When I got to the point, I was listening to it on audiobook, which is also, and it was read by Toni Morrison, which is an excellent way to experience that book, I think. But it was very sad. I also want to say that, you know, if you are sensitive to rough subject matter, maybe look up some content warnings before you read it, because it's rough to get through. But I do think it's an important story, and one that is written very beautifully and powerfully, and a great experience, even though it's also kind of a devastating experience. And for the last challenge of the reading rush, I read Burial Rites by Hannah Kent, and this book was great. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5. I don't really know why it didn't get a 5 out of 5, just that it just didn't quite, it wasn't like the most revolutionary thing I've ever read, but it was really good. The writing's really beautiful. It takes place in Iceland in the 1800s. I love me some historical fiction. I thought it was really good. I liked the format of the book. I thought it was really a powerful story written in a beautiful way, which I think I just said about the last book. But it's true. It really worked for me. I thought it was a good book. It's surprising to me that this was her debut work. And that brings us to the last book. Finally, I feel like this video is going to be really long, but that's okay. And the last book I read this month was The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. Is that? Yes, Elizabeth Acevedo. And I gave this book a 5 out of 5. It was so good. It's a novel, but it's written in verse. It's written, you know, as poetry. And it's sort of like, you kind of think of it as her diary that she's writing poetry into and then explaining, you know, the events going on in her life. It's about a young poet who kind of finds her voice and has to deal with a lot of implications of finding her voice, which are, you know, troubles with her family and troubles with her identity, troubles with her religious identity specifically, and I loved it. It tackled such difficult topics in such a successful way, and also I love reading poetry, and the poetry itself was really good, but then the message and the storyline was also amazing. So 5 out of 5, read The Poet X, honestly, it's really good. So there we have it, folks. That's all the books that I read this month, and I had a great time. I read so much, and hopefully I'm gonna read a bunch this month too. Yeah, there we go. That's all the books I read.